A black single dad had just been fired in front of nearly 200 coworkers, leaving the warehouse with nothing but a cardboard box, an old notebook, and a paper ruler his little boy had made by hand. Everyone thought they had just watched another ordinary employee lose everything, but 15 minutes later, one calm phone call brought an entire logistics network to a complete standstill. As executives scrambled to understand who could freeze hundreds of trucks with a single command, they uncovered years of quiet sacrifice, hidden responsibility, and a father who chose to protect strangers over his own career. This is the story of how the man everyone underestimated became the only person capable of saving the company from itself. The warehouse lights buzzed overhead, washing the polished concrete floor in a cold white glow that made every face look a little paler than it really was. Nearly 200 employees stood between loading docks and conveyor belts, whispering to one another as forklifts sat silent for the first time that morning. Nobody knew why the entire day shift had been called together. Regional Operations Manager Eric Dalton adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket, stepped onto the small safety platform, and looked over the crowd with practiced confidence. "Before we begin today's assignments," he announced, "there's an internal personnel matter that needs to be addressed." Conversations stopped. Near the middle of the group, Calvin Brooks stood quietly, with his work gloves tucked into one hand. His faded navy jacket still carried a trace of freezer frost from the cold storage section he had checked only minutes earlier. Eric looked directly at him. "Calvin Brooks." Calvin raised his head. "Your employment with Northline Supply is terminated effective immediately." The words echoed through the warehouse harder than anyone expected. A few workers exchanged confused looks. Someone in the back whispered, "What?" Eric continued without hesitation. "Your access privileges have been revoked. Security will escort you from the building after you collect your personal belongings." Calvin opened his mouth slightly, not to argue, but as if expecting there had been some mistake. "There must be." Eric lifted one hand. "This decision is final." Silence settled over the room. Jordan Reed, one of the newer drivers, stared across the crowd, his expression tightening. Dana Mills lowered her eyes toward the concrete floor. Leonard, the gray-haired maintenance engineer near Dock 12, folded his arms but said nothing. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Calvin slowly reached into his pocket, unclipped his employee badge, and placed it on the nearest packing table. The tiny plastic card made almost no sound when it landed. That somehow made the moment feel even heavier. A security guard approached, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Brooks," Calvin gave him a small nod before the man could finish. "It's okay." His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. He walked through familiar aisles one last time while dozens of coworkers watched from a distance. Inside his locker sat very little. A weathered notebook with worn corners, a folded lunch napkin he hadn't used, and a narrow strip of paper covered in crooked pencil marks. Miles's homemade height ruler. His 7-year-old son insisted on measuring everything. Trees, snowbanks, the family tomato plant, even his father's shoulders. Calvin carefully slid the paper ruler into the notebook before placing both inside a plain cardboard box. Nothing else seemed worth taking. Outside, the November rain had turned the parking lot into a sheet of dark reflections. Cold drops tapped against the cardboard lid as Calvin crossed toward his old pickup truck. Behind him, the warehouse doors closed with a heavy metallic thud. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Rain collected on his shoulders. His fingers rested on the edge of the box. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small phone. There was only one number he needed. No contact name. No photograph. Just 11 digits committed to memory years ago. The line connected after a single ring. A calm voice answered. "This is operations." Calvin looked back once at the enormous distribution center where trucks continued lining up outside the gates. He spoke only 4 words. "Activate Cedar Protocol, now." There was no surprise on the other end, only a brief pause. Then one quiet reply. "Understood." The call ended. Calvin slipped the phone back into his pocket without another word. He climbed into his truck but didn't start the engine. Rain rolled slowly across the windshield. Inside the warehouse, everything appeared normal, until exactly 15 minutes later. At Northline's Columbus control room, One monitor flashed yellow, then red. A warning tone sounded. Within seconds, identical alerts appeared in Cleveland, Indianapolis, and Louisville. Every outbound shipment changed to hold. Dispatch screens locked. Electronic gate arms froze in place. Temperature logs became read-only. Drivers waiting to leave received the same message. Federal Safety Review initiated. Operations suspended. One dispatcher blinked twice. What just happened? Another supervisor slammed his keyboard. I can't release any trucks. Across the warehouse floor, conveyor belts slowed before stopping completely. Forklifts idled where they stood. Loading crews looked toward management, waiting for instructions that never came. Eric Dalton rushed into the operations office. What is this? No one answered immediately. Every screen displayed the same red banner. Every command returned the same response. Authorization denied. Outside, Calvin remained seated inside his truck, watching raindrops race down the windshield. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes for one long breath. Because he knew exactly what those red screens meant. And he also knew something no one still standing inside Northline Supply had yet begun to understand. 3 years earlier, Calvin Brooks had promised himself that no job, no paycheck, and no title would ever become more important than the little boy waiting for him at home. Some promises were easier to make than to keep. His small duplex sat in a quiet working-class neighborhood east of Columbus, where freight trains rumbled past often enough that nobody bothered looking out the window anymore. The white paint on the porch had begun to peel, and the mailbox leaned slightly to one side after too many Ohio winters. But every morning before sunrise, one corner of that porch came alive. A dented old galvanized bucket rested beside the front steps, filled with dark soil and one stubborn tomato plant. Think it grew again? Miles asked as he hurried outside wearing sneakers without tying the laces. You tell me. The 7-year-old pulled a folded strip of paper from his backpack. The paper had faded from months of handling. Tiny pencil marks climbed one edge. Each line carried a date written in a child's uneven handwriting. Miles knelt beside the bucket and carefully held the paper against the tallest branch. Almost another inch, he whispered proudly. Calvin smiled. That's because somebody remembers to water it every day. Miles looked up. You mean us. I mean us. The boy grinned. That little correction mattered. Ever since his mother, Angela, passed away after unexpected heart complications 3 years earlier, Calvin had tried to replace every sentence that sounded lonely with one that sounded shared. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Inside the kitchen, breakfast was simple. Toast, scrambled eggs, one sliced apple divided between 2 plates. While Miles searched for his missing homework folder, Calvin quietly opened the drawer beside the refrigerator. The electric bill sat beneath a stack of grocery coupons. Past due. Second notice. He stared at it for only a second before sliding it back underneath the others. Miles didn't need to see that. Not yet. You coming? The boy called from the front door. Right behind you. On the drive to school, they played their usual game. Miles counted red pickup trucks. Calvin guessed which traffic lights would turn green before they reached them. For 12 peaceful minutes, the world felt wonderfully ordinary. As Calvin helped his son out of the truck, Miles suddenly asked, Dad? Yeah? If our tomato gets really big, do you think Mom would have liked it? Calvin looked toward the school entrance before answering. I think she'd tell us it needed a bigger bucket. Miles laughed. She always wanted bigger gardens. She did. The laughter faded as the boy adjusted his backpack. Then he hugged his father without saying another word. It lasted only a few seconds, but Calvin stood there a little longer after Miles disappeared through the school doors. Some mornings were like that. The hardest part of being a single father wasn't fixing problems. It was pretending the ones you couldn't fix weren't following you everywhere. By 7:30, he was back on the highway toward Northline Supply. The old pickup rattled louder than usual. Its heater worked only when it wanted to. Its gas gauge stuck every winter. Still, Calvin knew every sound it made, just like he knew every loading dock waiting for him. Before climbing out of the truck, he glanced once more at the folded paper ruler resting on the passenger seat. Miles had forgotten it that morning. Calvin picked it up carefully. "I'll bring it home tonight," he murmured to himself. He had no idea that by sunset, that tiny strip of paper would become one of the few things he still carried away from Northline. And somewhere inside the warehouse, long before anyone noticed, the first crack in a much larger problem had already begun to spread. Long before red warning screens and locked loading gates, Calvin Brooks had become the person everyone quietly searched for whenever something stopped working. Not because he wore a manager's badge, he didn't. His employee profile simply read, "Morning Logistics Coordinator." It sounded ordinary. His days never were. At 6:15 every morning, before most supervisors finished their first cup of coffee, Calvin was already walking the warehouse floor. He checked refrigeration units by hand, instead of trusting dashboards alone. He listened to conveyor motors as if they were conversations. He greeted forklift drivers by name and somehow remembered whose daughter had a softball tournament, whose mother had surgery scheduled, and whose son had just enlisted in the Marines. People noticed things like that. They remembered them. One rainy Tuesday, a refrigeration alarm flashed briefly on Dock 7 before disappearing. The control room dismissed it as a faulty sensor. Calvin didn't. He walked across the warehouse, pressed his palm against the steel wall of the trailer, and frowned. "Feels warmer than it should," the technician beside him shrugged. "The computer says it's fine," Calvin answered quietly. "The tomatoes don't know what the computer says." 20 minutes later, a failed cooling fan was discovered before thousands of pounds of produce spoiled. Nobody made a speech. Nobody applauded. The shipments simply left on time. Another problem solved. Another day nobody wrote his name into a report. That was how Calvin preferred it. Leonard often joked that Calvin could hear machines breathing. One afternoon, the older engineer leaned against a toolbox, watching Calvin reroute a delayed shipment around an interstate accident before dispatch had even received the traffic alert. "You know," Leonard said with a smile, "sometimes I think you remember this whole network better than the people who built it." Calvin chuckled without looking up. "I've just been here a while." Leonard studied him for a second longer. "No," he replied softly. "It's more than that." Before Calvin could answer, Eric Dalton stepped onto the warehouse floor. "There you are," Eric called. "I've been looking for dispatch." Calvin pointed toward the operations office. "They're updating Route 12. Eric barely acknowledged him before walking away. To Eric, Calvin was useful. Nothing more, nothing less. Later that afternoon, Calvin sat alone during his lunch break inside the small break room overlooking the loading yard. Instead of scrolling through his phone like everyone else, he opened the weathered notebook from his locker. Each page contained neat handwriting, dates, dock numbers, temperature readings, equipment failures, short observations, nothing dramatic, just facts. Near the top of one fresh page, he wrote only a single word, Cedar. Then he closed the notebook before anyone else entered. Across the room, Jordan Reed noticed the cover, but couldn't read what was inside. "What do you keep writing in that thing?" the young driver asked. Calvin smiled. "Things worth remembering." Jordan laughed. "My phone remembers everything." Calvin looked out toward the rows of waiting trailers. "Phones remember data." He tapped the notebook once. "People remember responsibility." Jordan wasn't sure what that meant. Neither was anyone else. By the end of the shift, another dispatch problem had been solved. Another refrigerated load reached a children's hospital on schedule. Another dozen people quietly thanked Calvin before driving home. Yet despite everything he did, his name appeared nowhere in the daily operations report that Eric submitted upstairs. Calvin never complained. He simply slipped the notebook back into his jacket, picked up the folded paper ruler Miles had forgotten that morning, and headed toward the parking lot. He didn't notice Eric watching him from the second-floor office window, but Eric had begun asking a question that would soon change both of their lives. Why did everyone seem to trust the quiet coordinator more than the man officially in charge? The answer came sooner than either of them expected. It was close to the end of a long Thursday shift when Jordan Reed walked into the dispatch office carrying his route sheet with trembling hands. "I'm over my legal driving hours," he said quietly. "If I take this run to Cincinnati, I'll be over the federal limit." Eric barely looked up from his laptop. "The customer expects that truck tonight." Jordan swallowed. "I understand, sir, but if there's an inspection..." There won't be. Eric slid the paperwork across the desk. Sign it. Jordan stared at the form. His wife was 34 weeks pregnant. Their insurance came through Northline. Missing a paycheck wasn't an option. Losing his job wasn't either. He reached for the pen. Before it touched the paper, another hand gently moved the clipboard away. Calvin. When did your shift start? He asked. 5 this morning. And you've already logged 11 hours behind the wheel? Jordan nodded. Calvin looked back at Eric. He can't legally take another run. Eric leaned back in his chair. I didn't ask for a legal opinion. You asked him to drive? I asked an employee to do his job. Calvin remained calm. Then let me do mine. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Eric stood. You want to solve the problem? I do. Fine. He pointed toward the route board. Take Jordan off the schedule if you're so concerned. Calvin walked to the magnetic dispatch board, removed Jordan's name from the Cincinnati route, and quietly replaced it with his own employee number. Jordan looked confused. You don't even drive long haul anymore. I know. So what are you doing? Calvin smiled faintly. Buying us time. He turned back toward Eric. I made the scheduling error. Write me up. Eric's eyes narrowed. You understand this will cost you your monthly performance bonus. I understand. And if corporate asks why the shipment is late? I'll answer. Eric picked up his pen, almost eagerly. You've got it. The disciplinary form was completed in less than 2 minutes. Jordan stood frozen. Mr. Brooks, you didn't have to. Calvin shook his head before the younger man could finish. Go home. But your wife needs you more than this warehouse does. Jordan lowered his eyes. No one had ever said something like that to him at work. Not once. He quietly folded the unsigned route sheet and slipped it into his jacket instead of throwing it away. Then, almost without thinking, he pulled out his phone. He took a quick photograph of the dispatch board showing the original assignment before Calvin had changed it. Moments later, another notification appeared. A text message from Eric sent earlier that afternoon. Keep everyone moving. I don't care if they're close to the limit. We can't afford delays. Jordan stared at the screen. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't delete it. That evening, Calvin stayed nearly an hour after everyone else had left, reorganizing deliveries so the shipment could leave legally with a rested driver the following morning. Nobody thanked him. There was no announcement, no recognition, only another deduction waiting on his next paycheck. As Calvin locked the dispatch office, Leonard watched from across the warehouse. You know, the older engineer said quietly, most people protect themselves first. Calvin slipped his notebook into his jacket. Then somebody has to protect everyone else. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Calvin climbed into his aging pickup and reached for the folded paper ruler Miles had left on the seat. He smiled to himself. He still had enough time to make it home before bedtime. Inside the warehouse, Eric watched Calvin's taillights disappear through the front gate. He believed he'd just taught one employee an expensive lesson about challenging authority. He had no idea that Jordan Reed had just walked away, carrying 2 things that would someday matter far more than either of them realized. A photograph and a text message. Jordan slipped both into his wallet without realizing they would someday become more valuable than any paycheck Northline had ever given him. The next 2 weeks passed with the steady rhythm of warehouse life. Trailers arrived before dawn. Forklifts hummed across polished concrete. Drivers hurried through coffee and paperwork before disappearing onto the interstate. On the surface, everything looked efficient. Calvin noticed something different. It started with a temperature report. Dock 11. Refrigerated pharmaceutical trailer. The digital monitor showed 38 degrees. Perfectly acceptable. But when Calvin opened the trailer doors, a wave of warm air brushed against his face. His eyes narrowed. He climbed inside with a handheld thermometer. 44 degrees. He checked another pallet. 45. Then another. Still climbing. The refrigeration unit had stopped running hours earlier. He walked back into dispatch carrying the handheld scanner. Dana. The quality control specialist looked up immediately. You seeing what I'm seeing? She compared the readings. Her expression changed. This can't be right. The system says everything stayed within range. It didn't. Dana quickly printed the transport log. Someone had manually adjusted the timestamps, not enough to attract attention, just enough to make it appear that the refrigeration unit had never failed. Calvin stared at the paperwork. Where's this shipment going? Dana checked the manifest. 4 rural medical clinics. She hesitated. And 2 children's hospitals. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Calvin imagined parents waiting beside hospital beds, trusting that the medicine arriving inside those insulated containers had been handled exactly as promised. Trust. That was what every shipment really carried. He picked up the phone. Hold every truck assigned to this trailer. Dana looked at him. Eric's going to lose his mind. I know. Within minutes, Eric stormed into the loading bay. What are you doing? Calvin calmly handed him the thermometer. The insulin's been outside the safe temperature range. Eric barely glanced at it. Reset the log. Calvin blinked. I beg your pardon? You heard me. Eric lowered his voice. The customer needs that shipment today. It may not be safe. We don't know that. We know enough to stop it. Eric stepped closer. You've already cost this company 1 performance bonus. I'm not talking about bonuses. Neither am I. Eric pointed toward the waiting trailer. I'm talking about a contract worth millions. Calvin looked through the open trailer doors at hundreds of carefully packed insulated containers. Then he quietly reached for the electronic loading tablet. Instead of approving departure, he pressed another option. Shipment locked. The security seal automatically activated. The trailer doors clicked shut. Eric's face reddened. What did you just do? I prevented it from leaving. You don't have authority. I have responsibility. The words hung between them. Several warehouse workers stopped what they were doing. Nobody dared interrupt. Eric took a slow breath. You realize this decision could cost people their jobs? Calvin answered without raising his voice. And if this medicine isn't safe, it could cost someone a child. Silence. The only sound came from a forklift backing away with its warning alarm beeping softly across the warehouse. Eric leaned closer. You'll regret this. Maybe. Calvin picked up his phone again. Instead of calling another manager, he contacted each receiving clinic listed on the manifest. One by one, he advised them not to administer the shipment unless independent testing confirmed the medication remained stable. Dana watched quietly from across the desk. Every call Calvin made increased the chance that corporate headquarters would blame him. Every minute the trailer remained sealed increased the financial loss. Yet Calvin never hesitated. When the final clinic thanked him for the warning, he slowly placed the phone back into his pocket. Across the warehouse, Eric was already typing an email. Its subject line contained only 5 words. Immediate review of Calvin Brooks. Calvin didn't see the message. He was standing beside the locked trailer, looking at the security seal as though he were guarding something far more important than cargo. Because in his mind, he wasn't protecting medicine. He was protecting the people waiting for it. That night, Calvin didn't get home until nearly 7. The porch light had already come on, casting a warm circle across the old wooden steps. The tomato plant in the dented tin bucket leaned slightly toward the fading sunlight, its leaves beginning to curl after missing a day of watering. Dad! Miles burst through the front door before Calvin had both feet on the porch. I thought maybe you got stuck in traffic again. Calvin forced a smile. I did. A little. It wasn't a complete lie. Some traffic happened on highways. Some happened inside people's consciences. They ate dinner at the small kitchen table where Angela had once insisted every meal be shared, no matter how simple it was. Tonight, it was grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup from a can. Miles didn't complain. He almost never did. Halfway through dinner, he looked up. Don't forget tomorrow, Calvin frowned. Tomorrow? My science presentation. The boy pointed toward a colorful foam board model resting carefully against the dining room wall. Painted planets hung from thin strings, each one cut out by hand. You promised, Calvin immediately nodded. I'll be there. You'll sit in the front row. I will. And don't come in after I start talking. Calvin laughed softly. I won't. Miles smiled with complete confidence. To him, promises still felt unbreakable. The next morning began before sunrise. Calvin watered the tomato plant with Miles before driving him to school. The paper ruler came out once again. It grew. Just a little, Calvin said. Miles grinned. It still counts. It always counts. Those words stayed with Calvin all morning. Back at Northline, however, nothing felt small anymore. Eric had scheduled back-to-back meetings with regional supervisors after the delayed insulin shipment. Corporate compliance wanted written explanations. The pharmaceutical client demanded answers. Phones rang constantly. Dana quietly handed Calvin another folder. They're asking for every temperature log from the last 6 months. Good. You don't seem worried. I am. He paused. But worried doesn't change facts. For most of the afternoon, Calvin worked through maintenance records, refrigeration reports, and shipment histories. Every document had to match. Every timestamp had to be verified. At 1:40 p.m., his phone vibrated. Miles's school, he answered immediately. Mr. Brooks? The teacher asked gently. We're starting in 20 minutes. I know. I'm looking forward to seeing you. So is Miles. Calvin looked at the clock. Plenty of time. He gathered his folder. Just then Dana hurried toward him. Calvin. She looked pale. I found another discrepancy. She spread several printed reports across his desk. Temperature records, different timestamps, different user IDs. Someone had altered another shipment. If we don't preserve these now, she whispered, they could disappear. Calvin stared at the papers. His car keys sat inches away. So did the school visitor badge he had printed online the night before. He looked at the clock again. 2 o'clock. The presentation began at 2:15. I'll only need 15 minutes, he quietly said. Dana nodded. We'll be done before then. 15 minutes became 30. 30 became 45. By the time Calvin pulled into the elementary school parking lot, children were already spilling out through the front doors with backpacks bouncing behind them. Inside the multipurpose room, folding chairs stood empty. Construction paper planets still hung from the ceiling. Miles sat alone near the edge of the stage, carefully placing his solar system into a cardboard box. He looked up as Calvin entered. You came. The words weren't angry. They were hopeful. That somehow hurt even more. I'm sorry, buddy, Miles shrugged. It's okay. His teacher quietly walked away, giving them privacy. They carried the project to the truck together without speaking. Halfway home, Miles finally asked the question that stayed with Calvin long after the road had disappeared behind them. Dad? Yeah? Do the trucks need you more than I do? Calvin's hands tightened around the steering wheel. For several seconds, he couldn't answer. He pulled the pickup onto the shoulder of the quiet neighborhood road. The engine idled. Rain clouds gathered overhead. He turned toward his son. No. Miles waited. Then why weren't you there? Calvin lowered his eyes. Because he didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 7-year-old. Or to himself. When they finally reached home that evening, Calvin quietly folded Miles's paper ruler and slipped it inside the worn notebook he carried every day. Not to protect the paper. To remind himself. No matter what happened inside Northline Supply, he could never allow himself to lose the one job nobody else in the world could do for him. The next morning, Calvin arrived almost an hour earlier than usual. The warehouse was still quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of refrigeration compressors and the soft beeping of forklifts being inspected before the morning rush. He carried 2 things into the dispatch office, a travel mug of black coffee, and the report he had finished before leaving the night before. Every temperature reading. Every handwritten note, every timestamp copied directly from the handheld scanner. He logged into the system, uploaded the report, and sent it to Quality Assurance, Regional Compliance, and Eric Dalton. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Dana appeared a few minutes later, carrying another stack of files. You actually slept? She asked. Not much. She managed a tired smile. Neither did I. The smile disappeared the moment she opened the digital archive. Calvin? He walked over. What is it? Dana clicked through several screens, her expression growing more confused with every page. The file changed. It shouldn't be able to. I know. She opened the shipment history. The refrigeration failure was gone. The alarm logs had vanished. The departure delay now appeared to have been caused by one decision, approved by Calvin Brooks. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Calvin leaned closer to the monitor. No. Dana continued searching. The handwritten scanner entries were missing. The original temperature graph had been replaced with a smooth, uninterrupted line showing perfect storage conditions from beginning to end. Someone hadn't simply deleted evidence, someone had rewritten the story. Calvin quietly opened the notebook from his jacket. He compared his handwritten times with the altered digital records. Every note still matched his memory. Only the system had changed. Dana lowered her voice. This isn't the first one. What do you mean? She opened another shipment, then another. Small adjustments, different dates, different products. Always the same pattern. Safety alerts disappeared. Approval records shifted. Responsibility quietly landed on employees who had no authority to question them. How long? Calvin asked. I don't know. She hesitated before adding, but long enough that somebody knows exactly what they're doing. Calvin looked through the office window toward Eric's second-floor office. The blinds were closed. A light still glowed inside. His first instinct was to walk upstairs immediately, demand answers, force the issue into the open. Instead, he closed the notebook. No. Dana looked surprised. We're not saying anything? Not yet. But they just blamed you. I know. If we wait, they could erase even more. Calvin nodded slowly. And if we move too soon, they'll erase Dana Mills and Jordan Reed, right along with the files. She understood exactly what he meant. Anyone connected to the evidence could become the next target. For the rest of the day, Calvin acted as though nothing had happened. He answered dispatch calls, redirected, delayed trailers, helped a driver locate a missing pallet. He even nodded politely when Eric walked past without acknowledging him. But every chance he had, he quietly wrote another page into the notebook. Dates, times, user IDs, questions, patterns. Facts couldn't defend themselves. Someone had to remember them. That evening, Calvin pulled into his driveway just before sunset. Miles was already outside with a watering can almost as big as his arms. Dad, I didn't forget today. I know. Together, they walked toward the old tin bucket. The tomato plant looked different. Its leaves drooped slightly. The soil had cracked from missing too many evenings of care. Miles frowned. It looks sick. Calvin knelt beside him. It isn't dead. How do you know? He pressed one finger gently into the soil. The roots are still holding. They watered it together in silence. After a few minutes, the leaves seemed to lift ever so slightly. Miles smiled. See? Calvin smiled back, though his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Sometimes damage happened slowly enough that people stopped noticing it, until one day the whole plant leaned. As they walked inside, Calvin glanced once more at the tomato plant, then at the notebook tucked beneath his arm. He realized they were becoming strangely alike. Both depended on someone refusing to ignore the first signs of trouble. And somewhere inside Northline's computer system, someone had already begun noticing that Calvin Brooks wasn't asking the wrong questions anymore. He was asking the right ones. 3 nights later, Leonard called him just after Miles had fallen asleep. Meet me at Harper's Diner, the older man said. Don't bring your notebook into the warehouse tomorrow until we talk. The diner sat beside an old truck stop where interstate traffic never completely disappeared. Rain tapped softly against the windows while coffee mugs clinked in the background. Leonard was already waiting in the last booth, a faded manila folder resting beside his untouched pie. I've been thinking about what's happening, he began, and I think you're looking at the symptoms instead of the foundation. Calvin slid into the booth. What foundation? Leonard pushed the folder across the table. Inside were engineering drawings, meeting notes, and photographs from more than a decade earlier. Calvin recognized every page. So, you kept copies. I keep history, Leonard replied. Someone has to. One photograph showed a much younger Calvin wearing a reflective safety vest instead of the blue dispatch jacket everyone now associated with him. Around him stood software engineers, safety inspectors, warehouse planners, and emergency response coordinators. They weren't celebrating. They were rebuilding. It was after the contamination crisis, Leonard said quietly. Remember? Calvin nodded. A nationwide logistics failure had allowed temperature-sensitive food products to move through multiple warehouses before anyone realized the tracking data had been altered. The investigation had exposed one painful truth. If safety records could be rewritten, people could get hurt long before anyone discovered the lie. Northline had spent nearly 2 years designing a new emergency safeguard, not to protect profits, to protect lives. Leonard tapped one document. "You wrote this section." Calvin looked down. His own signature appeared beneath a proposal titled Emergency Network Safety Isolation Procedure. Below it, in smaller letters, was the project name. Cedar. "I thought they replaced this years ago," Calvin murmured. "They upgraded the software." Leonard smiled faintly. "They never replaced the principal." He leaned closer. 3 people were authorized to activate an independent network review. Calvin remained silent. 1 retired. 1 passed away. Leonard's eyes settled on him, and 1 never used it. The weight of those words filled the booth. Calvin remembered every debate from those meetings. Executives had argued that freezing an entire logistics network could cost millions of dollars. Calvin had argued something simpler. If the data can't be trusted, he had said back then, nothing should move until the truth catches up. The policy had survived. His name had remained attached to 1 emergency authorization, even after promotions, reorganizations, and management changes buried its history, not because he held an executive title, because he had helped build the safeguard itself. Leonard stirred his coffee. Most people think authority comes from a position. He looked directly at Calvin. Sometimes it comes from responsibility. Calvin stared through the rain-covered window toward the endless line of trucks rolling down the interstate. "I've never activated Cedar." "I know. It shuts down more than 1 warehouse." "I know. It affects drivers, families, hospitals, everyone." Leonard nodded, which is exactly why nobody should use it unless they have no other choice. Silence settled between them. Finally, Calvin asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of his mind for weeks. "What if I'm wrong?" Leonard answered without hesitation. "What if you're right?" Neither man spoke after that. When Calvin finally gathered the folder, he carefully tucked Miles's folded paper ruler back inside his notebook before closing it. The old engineer noticed. "Still carrying that?" Calvin smiled. "It reminds me what all of this is really for." As he stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The night air felt unusually still. Across town, inside Northline's regional office, Eric Dalton was reviewing security logs with the IT department. One analyst pointed toward the screen. "Someone has been accessing archived safety records." Eric's expression hardened. "Who?" The technician clicked another report. The answer appeared almost immediately. Calvin Brooks. Eric leaned back slowly. For the first time, he stopped seeing Calvin as a stubborn coordinator. He began seeing him as something much more dangerous, someone who understood the system well enough to know exactly where its strongest protections had been hidden all along. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside Northline Supply had changed. People lowered their voices when they walked past the dispatch office. Supervisors stopped conversations the moment Calvin entered a room. Even the security guards seemed to be watching the warehouse floor more carefully than usual. At 9:35 a.m., every employee received the same notification. Mandatory operations meeting. Attendance required. Jordan looked across the loading dock toward Calvin. "This doesn't feel right." Calvin quietly finished checking a refrigerated trailer before closing his inspection clipboard. "No," he said. "It doesn't." Nearly 200 employees gathered beneath the bright warehouse lights. Forklifts sat motionless. Loading bays stood open. The building felt strangely silent without the constant movement that usually filled every corner. Eric Dalton stepped onto the safety platform with a folder in his hand. His voice echoed through the warehouse. "Over the past several weeks, we've experienced repeated operational disruptions, unnecessary shipment delays, and unauthorized interference with company procedures." No names. Not yet. Several employees exchanged uncertain glances. Eric opened the folder. "Our investigation has identified the individual responsible." He looked directly at Calvin. "Calvin Brooks." The room froze. Jordan instinctively took one step forward before stopping himself. Dana remained perfectly still, though her hands tightened around the clipboard she carried. Eric continued. Mr. Brooks deliberately obstructed company operations, manipulated shipment schedules, exceeded his authority, and caused significant financial damage. Every accusation sounded rehearsed. Calvin listened without interrupting. He knew exactly what Eric was trying to accomplish. This meeting wasn't meant to discover the truth. It was meant to decide who everyone would believe. Effective immediately, Eric announced. Your employment with Northline Supply is terminated. The words settled heavily across the warehouse. Someone quietly whispered, "That can't be right." Another employee looked down instead of toward Calvin. Fear spread faster than disagreement. Eric pointed toward two security officers waiting nearby. Escort him from the property. One of the officers approached with visible hesitation. Mr. Brooks, Calvin offered him a small, understanding nod. It's all right. Without protest, he unclipped his employee badge and placed it on the dispatch counter. The familiar click of plastic against metal seemed louder than Eric's speech. He walked toward his locker. Inside waited only a few personal belongings, the weathered notebook, a lunch container, and the folded paper ruler Miles had forgotten days earlier. Calvin picked it up carefully before closing the locker for what everyone believed would be the last time. As he walked toward the exit, he noticed Jordan standing near the back of the crowd. The young driver's jaw was clenched. Inside his pocket rested the photograph of the original dispatch board and Eric's text message ordering drivers to ignore legal hour limits. Jordan didn't move, but he didn't look away either. Near the quality control office, Dana met Calvin's eyes for only a brief moment. She gave the smallest nod. Not a goodbye, a promise. She had made her decision. She would not let the evidence disappear. Outside, cold rain had begun falling again. The warehouse doors closed behind Calvin with a deep metallic sound. He stood alone in the parking lot holding the cardboard box beneath one arm. Inside it, the notebook rested beside Miles's paper ruler. Two ordinary objects. Two pieces of a story no one inside the building fully understood. Across the parking lot, Calvin looked back once at the massive distribution center. Rows of trailers waited at the loading docks. Employees hurried through windows lit by fluorescent lights. From a distance, everything appeared perfectly normal, but appearances had become Northline's greatest lie. He reached into his jacket and wrapped his hand around his phone. He didn't dial. Not yet. There was still one final decision to make. If he acted too soon, innocent employees could suffer alongside those responsible. If he waited too long, altered records might become permanent, unsafe shipments could continue moving, and the people he had spent years protecting would never know how close they had come to disaster. Rain dripped steadily from the brim of his cap. Behind the warehouse walls, Eric believed he had finally removed the one employee who kept asking inconvenient questions. What Eric failed to understand was that he had also removed the only man who still possessed the authority to stop the entire network before another dangerous shipment reached the people depending on it. Calvin looked at the dark screen of his phone. He took one slow breath. Then he unlocked it. The next call would determine whether Northline continued operating, or whether every truck in its system would soon be forced to stand perfectly still. Calvin looked through the rain-covered windshield one last time before pressing the call button. The line connected almost instantly. "This is operations." His voice was calm. "Activate Cedar Protocol, effective immediately." There was no hesitation. Identity confirmed. A brief pause followed. Cedar Protocol is now in motion. The call ended. Calvin rested the phone on the passenger seat beside the cardboard box that held his notebook and Miles's folded paper ruler. He knew exactly what would happen next, not because he wanted revenge, because he had helped write the procedure years ago. Exactly 15 minutes later, inside Northline's regional control center, every dispatch monitor flashed yellow before turning solid red. An alarm echoed through the operations room. Dispatchers froze. What just happened? Another employee tried releasing the next outbound trailer. The system rejected the command. Safety. Isolation active. Across Columbus, Cleveland, and Indianapolis, gate arms lowered automatically. Electronic shipping manifests became read-only. Route changes were disabled, temperature records locked. No shipment carrying medical products or refrigerated goods could legally leave until the automated safety review was completed. Eric Dalton rushed into the control room. "Overwrite it." "We can't." "Then reboot the servers." "We already tried." "Call it." "They're locked out too." Every answer sounded worse than the one before it. On another screen, a timer appeared. Independent safety verification required. Estimated review window, 6 hours. Eric slammed his hand against the operations desk. This is sabotage. No one answered, because no one could honestly say that it was. Across the warehouse floor, confusion spread quickly. Drivers climbed down from their cabs. Forklift operators shut off engines. Dispatch radios crackled nonstop. Nobody knew whether they were supposed to wait, unload, or leave. Jordan stood beside his truck, reading the red message on the handheld scanner. He quietly slipped his keys back into his pocket. "I'm not driving until they clear those shipments," he said. Another driver overheard him. "If Jordan's waiting, I'm waiting too." Within minutes, half a dozen drivers had reached the same conclusion. Not because anyone ordered them to, because they trusted Calvin more than they trusted the explanations coming from management. Meanwhile, Dana sat alone inside the quality control office. Her computer still had access to archived audit files that the safety lock had frozen before anyone could alter them again. She inserted a small flash drive. Every original temperature log, every deleted warning, every modification history began copying one file at a time. Outside her office, footsteps approached. Dana quickly minimized the screen. A supervisor opened the door. "Corporate wants every report." "I'm gathering them now." He glanced around before leaving without another word. Only after the door closed did Dana exhale. The progress bar continued moving. 32%. Across town, Calvin sat inside his truck parked beneath a line of maple trees near Miles's school. He could have driven away. Instead, he waited. His phone rang. "Leonard, you actually did it." "I had to." "They're saying the entire network is frozen." "It isn't frozen." Leonard paused. "What do you mean?" "It's protected." Those words carried more weight than anyone inside Northline yet understood. The protocol wasn't designed to punish a company. It was designed to stop uncertain information from becoming irreversible harm. Every minute the system remained locked gave investigators one more minute to separate truth from manipulation. Another call came. "Jordan, I just wanted you to know." He looked back toward the idle warehouse. "Nobody's blaming you out here." Calvin closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you." "We're staying parked." "You don't have to." "We know." Jordan smiled quietly. "That's exactly why we are." One act of kindness had become another, then another. By mid-afternoon, nearly every veteran driver had voluntarily refused to move temperature-sensitive freight until independent inspectors confirmed the records were accurate. No union vote, no protest, no speeches. Just ordinary people choosing caution over convenience because one quiet father had spent years proving that safety mattered more than speed. At 3:18 p.m., Calvin received one final call. This time, it came from a federal safety investigator assigned automatically through Cedar. His tone was professional. "Mr. Brooks, preliminary review confirms irregularities in the shipment records." Calvin listened silently. "But understand this," the investigator continued. "If your concerns cannot be substantiated before today's review closes, you may be held responsible for every operational loss caused by this shutdown." The line went quiet. Calvin looked toward the elementary school as children began leaving the building. Miles appeared carrying his backpack almost bigger than himself. For just a moment, Calvin forgot about warehouses, investigations, and frozen dispatch systems. Then he remembered the clock. Less than 2 hours remained. Everything now depended on whether the truth could reach the people who needed to hear it. Before Cedar released the network again. At 3:42 p.m., Calvin walked into Northline's regional headquarters, carrying nothing but the weathered notebook under one arm and the cardboard box from the parking lot beneath the other. The security guard at the front desk looked up in surprise. "I'm sorry, sir. You were removed from the property this morning." Before Calvin could answer, a woman wearing a federal identification badge stepped through the revolving doors. "I'm Inspector Laura Chen." Office of Transportation Safety, she said. Mr. Brooks is here at our request. The guard immediately stepped aside. Upstairs, the conference room no longer resembled a corporate meeting. Federal investigators sat beside regional executives. Company attorneys lined one side of the table. Eric Dalton stood near the presentation screen, his confidence still intact but noticeably strained. The moment Calvin entered, Eric folded his arms. "So, this is your plan?" he asked. "Shut down an entire distribution network because you couldn't accept being fired?" Calvin placed the notebook on the table. "I accepted being fired." He looked directly at Eric. "I couldn't accept unsafe shipments." The room became very still. Inspector Chen spoke first. "We're not here to discuss personnel decisions. We're here to determine whether Cedar Protocol was activated in good faith." Eric immediately stepped forward. "It wasn't. Mr. Brooks abused an outdated emergency process after his termination. He deliberately disrupted operations and caused millions in losses." Calvin didn't interrupt. He waited. The investigator turned toward him. "Mr. Brooks?" Instead of defending himself, Calvin opened his notebook. Every page contained dates, times, trailer numbers, equipment IDs. Each handwritten note matched a corresponding document Dana had quietly copied before the system locked. A technician connected Dana's flash drive to the conference room monitor. Original temperature logs appeared beside the altered digital records. The differences were impossible to ignore. Minute by minute, degree by degree, user by user. Someone had rewritten history. Eric cleared his throat. "Those files could have been manipulated." "I thought you might say that," Dana replied. Until that moment, nobody had realized she was standing near the back of the room. She stepped forward carrying a printed audit trail. "The system records every edit, even when someone deletes the visible history." She pointed to several highlighted entries. The original files were changed after Calvin submitted his report. The investigator leaned closer. "Who had access?" Dana answered quietly. "Regional management." Silence spread across the room. Eric looked toward the company attorneys. "This proves nothing." Another voice interrupted him. "It proves more than you think." Jordan Reed walked through the doorway, still wearing his driver's uniform, still carrying his phone. "I was there the day Mr. Brooks removed me from that illegal route." He displayed the photograph he had taken weeks earlier. The original dispatch board filled the screen. His next image showed Eric's text message. "Keep everyone moving. I don't care if they're close to the limit. We can't afford delays." No one spoke. Then Leonard slowly rose from his chair. For years, people had known him as the quiet engineer who fixed conveyor belts and refrigeration units. Now, he carried a thick binder. "I helped build Cedar," he said. He opened the binder to a page covered with signatures. Mr. Brooks wrote the operating principles that require an independent safety shutdown whenever shipment records can no longer be trusted. He looked around the room. Cedar didn't create today's crisis. He paused. It exposed one that was already here. Inspector Chen folded her hands. "Mr. Brooks." Calvin looked up. "One question." She waited. "Why didn't you activate Cedar sooner?" For the first time all afternoon, Calvin hesitated. When he finally answered, his voice was softer than before. "Because I thought I could fix it quietly." He glanced toward Dana. "I didn't want anyone else losing their job." Then toward Jordan. "I thought carrying the burden myself would protect people." His eyes settled on the notebook. "I was wrong." The room remained silent. "I spent so many years believing that keeping my head down was the responsible thing to do." He looked back at the investigators. But silence didn't protect the truth. He took one slow breath. It protected the people, changing it. No one challenged him. Not because his words were dramatic, because every piece of evidence now sitting on that conference table said exactly the same thing. For the first time that day, Eric Dalton realized he was no longer arguing against one quiet warehouse coordinator. He was arguing against the truth itself, and the truth had finally found witnesses who refused to stay silent. The conference room remained quiet long after Calvin finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the silence. Inspector Laura Chen looked down at the evidence spread across the table. Dana's audit logs, Jordan's photograph, Leonard's original Cedar documentation, and Calvin's worn notebook filled with months of handwritten observations. Each piece alone raised questions. Together, they answered them. She closed the final folder and addressed Northline's executive vice president, who had arrived halfway through the hearing. The evidence establishes a pattern of altered safety records, suppressed reporting, and operational decisions that violated company policy and federal transportation standards. She paused before adding the sentence everyone in the room understood was coming. Cedar Protocol was activated appropriately. Eric Dalton's shoulders dropped for the first time that day. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted. "We were under enormous pressure to keep deliveries moving." The executive vice president looked at him steadily. "Pressure explains mistakes." He glanced toward the altered records. "It does not explain changing evidence." Within minutes, Eric was asked to surrender his company badge, not in anger, not with humiliation, simply because the facts no longer allowed him to remain in charge. The internal investigation expanded over the following weeks. Every altered shipment record was reviewed. The compromised insulin shipment was permanently withdrawn before reaching a single patient. Independent auditors discovered several additional cases where safety warnings had been minimized or delayed in pursuit of delivery targets. Northline's board approved sweeping changes. Quality control would report independently from operations. No shipment containing medication or temperature-sensitive medical supplies could leave without dual verification. A confidential safety reporting system was established so employees could raise concerns without fearing retaliation. Jordan accepted an invitation to become the driver's safety representative. Dana was promoted to Director of Compliance and Quality Assurance. Leonard, smiling more than anyone had seen in years, agreed to stay on another year to help train the next generation of engineers. A week later, Calvin received a phone call. The executive vice president asked him to return. Not as a dispatcher, not as a coordinator, as Director of Operational Safety. The salary was generous. The authority was real. Calvin listened quietly, before asking only one question. "If I accept, can my schedule allow me to pick up my son from school every Tuesday and Thursday?" There was a brief silence. Then the answer came. "Yes. Put it in writing." They did. Only then did Calvin accept. On his first morning back, employees greeted him differently, not because his title had changed, because they finally understood the weight he had been carrying long before anyone noticed. No speeches were given. No celebration was planned. Calvin simply walked through the warehouse exactly as he always had, stopping to shake hands, asking drivers about their families, and checking refrigeration units with the same careful attention. Some things never needed changing. That Sunday afternoon, the air was warm enough for Miles to work outside without a jacket. Together, father and son lifted the tomato plant from the old dented tin bucket. Its roots had filled every inch of space. "I guess Mom was right," Miles laughed. "It needed a bigger home." Calvin smiled. It did. They gently lowered the plant into a sturdy wooden planter they had built together that morning. Miles unfolded his paper ruler, the same one Calvin had carried home in the cardboard box on the day he lost his job. He measured the tallest branch. It grew almost 6 inches. Calvin nodded. It had room. Miles looked up at his father. "Were you the one who saved your company?" Calvin rested one hand on the edge of the planter before answering. "I didn't save a company." Miles waited. "I stopped something dangerous long enough for good people to do the right thing." The boy thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded, as though the answer made perfect sense. As evening settled over the neighborhood, they carried 2 lawn chairs onto the porch. The tomato plant stood taller in its new planter. The old tin bucket remained beside it, not thrown away, just empty. A reminder that strong roots sometimes outgrow the place where they began. Calvin looked toward the fading sunset. He realized the greatest reward had never been getting his job back. It wasn't the promotion. It wasn't being proven right. It was knowing that when Miles someday remembered his father, he wouldn't remember the day he was fired. He would remember a man who chose integrity over comfort, kindness over fear, and truth over silence. And perhaps, years from now, when his own life placed someone else's safety in his hands, he would quietly make the same choice. Because real strength isn't measured by how loudly a person can speak. It's measured by what they're willing to protect when no one is watching. When Miles measured that tomato plant one last time with the same little paper ruler Calvin had carried out of Northline on the day he was fired, it wasn't the promotion that mattered anymore. It was the quiet proof that a father had protected both his son and countless strangers without ever asking for applause. This story reminds us that the bravest moments aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes one courageous decision, to refuse the easy way out even when you stand alone, is enough to change the future for people you'll never even meet. The next time you feel pressured to stay quiet about something you know isn't right, remember what Calvin chose to do. You don't have to change the whole world today. You only have to protect the one person or the one truth that's been placed in your care. If Calvin's story stayed with you, leave a 1 in the comments below and tell me this. Have you ever made a difficult choice because it was the right thing to do, even when it cost you something? I'd love to read your story. And before you go, stay with us, because the next story will remind you that sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the greatest burden of all.